Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Podesta. I am the founder of the Center for American Progress. On behalf of CAP and the Institute for Public Policy Research, welcome to today's event. Joining me today are two all-star voices in the fight for climate action and clean energy transition. British Member of Parliament and our good friend Ed Miliband, who serves as the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero for the Labour Party, and Emma Rebhorn, the Deputy Executive Director for Climate Jobs National Resource Center. I'll say a little bit more about each of them, but let me just give an overview of what we're going to talk about here this afternoon. In the United States, 2020 was the first election cycle in which climate policy was positioned front and center by a winning presidential candidate, really core to his economic theory of the case. Since then, President Biden has committed to a string of transformational policies. He's pledged a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions based on peak levels by 2030. He's also advanced, amongst other things, the Justice 40 initiative, which commits 40% of federal climate and clean energy investments to aid disadvantaged communities, and the 30 by 30 initiative, a policy to conserve 30% of our lands and oceans by the year 2030. In the UK, the Labour Party has also advanced and unveiled ambitious policies really kind of aimed at the same purpose, with massive investments to make this transition to solve the climate crisis. Last year, Labour committed to an annual $28 billion green investment fund if elected into power, as well as a mass retrofitting program and a pledge to enact a net zero and nature test for every policy. Actions like these are essential to meet the moment we're in. Report after report warns that we're moving in the wrong direction. We can see it all around us. The heat waves here in the Northeast, the fires in New Mexico, the heat waves in Europe, the tropical cyclones, killer cyclones in Africa and the Philippines, the massive heat in India and Bangladesh. We're feeling it almost every day. It's kind of central now to the way we're living. A UN report released just days ago stated that greenhouse gas concentrations, the rise in sea level, ocean temperatures, and ocean acidification all reached record highs in 2021. A recent Met Office report in the UK stated that there's now a 50-50 chance that the world will warm by 1.5 degrees Celsius over the next 5 years. And all of this comes on top of the 2022 IPCC report from just a few months ago, which stated that any further delay in global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. In other words, time is running out. As the Secretary General has said, it's code red for humanity. In order to be successful, it's vital that climate action be positioned and understood as something not only good for our planet, but good for livelihoods, good for jobs, for families, for building an equitable and inclusive economy. And that's how the Biden administration sees it. Take the renewable energy tax credits, for example. These would not only support our shift to clean energy economy, but they would also lift up labor and domestic content standards. Approaches like that ensure that climate action goes hand in hand with a fight for justice and improving the lives of ordinary citizens. Just about a year ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with U.S. Senator Ed Markey and Ed's colleague, U.S. Member of Parliament David Lammy, on exactly this topic. David's now the Shadow Secretary for Foreign Policy, on how climate action can take the form of climate and environmental justice here in the U.S. and in the UK. And we need to learn from each other. We also need to make sure that these ambitions are global, that they extend beyond our two countries. No country can tackle this crisis on its own. We need to ensure that there's a level playing field in global trade and global action so that nations and industries don't seek loopholes in the race to the bottom, but instead push each other for cleaner and more innovative solutions in a real race to the top. The global arrangement on steel and aluminum is an example of that. That promotes the production of products in a way that results in lower greenhouse gas emissions than industry average, and could establish barriers for items that continue on a dirty path. What's more, we also need to ensure that we learn our lesson from the past few months. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has proved the point loud and clear that energy policy is national security policy. An energy sector heavily reliant on foreign supply or on a volatile global market is one that's dangerously exposed. We've seen it in skyrocketing gasoline prices and energy bills both here and in Europe. A successful climate policy must keep its focus on energy security, and the shift to renewable energy has proven to be the only real solution to both the national security crisis and the climate crisis. So that's what we're here today to discuss. I know Ed and Emma bring a wealth of perspective and experience to the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, Ed Miliband is the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero for the Labor Party. He's also currently serving as co-chair of the Institute for Public Policy Research Environmental Justice Commission. He previously served as the leader of the Labor Party from 2010 to 2015, and prior to that served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2008 to 2010. As I said to him earlier, I think that's when we first got to know each other. Emma Rebhorn has been Deputy Executive Director of Climate Jobs National Resource Center, which I'm going to ask her to describe, since June of last year. And in that role, she's coordinated the organization's offshore wind campaign. Emma previously served as the Assistant General Counsel for Change to Win. She spent over a decade in the labor movement, working for the Communication Workers of America and for the Teamsters. We're really happy to have both of you here today. We expect a lively conversation. Ed, I'm going to start with you. And I want you to, as I noted, you've set forward very strong policies to transition the UK to clean energy, making these massive investments. But right now, we're in a different kind of energy crisis, maybe one that's different than even when Labor was planning that agenda, one of high prices that are caused by the war in Ukraine. How are you thinking about this now? What's your perspective in terms of how you both meet the needs of household budgets in terms of the energy prices that people in Britain are experiencing, but make that transition to a clean and cheaper future?
Well, look, John, it's great to be here, and I want to thank you for your incredible leadership on the climate issue, which is recognized all around the world, and also the extraordinary work that Center for American Progress does, which again is looked to internationally. You're completely right about this, which is we are not just facing a climate crisis now. We are facing, in the case of the UK, a cost of living crisis and an energy security crisis. Now, I think what's so interesting about this, and I speak about a UK context, is that the answer to the climate crisis is also the answer to the cost of living and energy security crisis. The cheapest, cleanest power we have at our disposal in the UK is onshore wind and solar. And we have been calling for a green energy sprint to drive forward on this. Without getting into the detail of UK domestic policy, there have been restrictions because of planning rules on the amount of onshore wind that we can deploy, and that is driving up bills for consumers and driving up imports. And so actually, you know, I think we are at a pivotal moment for the world in how it reacts to this energy crisis that we face. Do we abandon our climate ambitions, or do we double down on them? And I actually think that all of the evidence I've seen suggests we need to go further and faster when it comes to that transition. I'll also give you another example. We have, as you said in your introduction, a big program of energy efficiency, insulation. We have some of the coldest, draftiest homes in Europe. Yeah, I know there's knowing laughter. People who stayed in the UK, you may well have experienced that. We can make a difference with a real mission to insulate those cold, drafty homes. We can make a difference when it comes to carbon emissions. We can make a difference when it comes to people's energy bills. We can make a difference when it comes to the amount of fossil fuels we need to use. So all of these solutions point in one direction. And you know, I think what's so interesting about this, you and I have been at this a long time. If I had to name one thing that has changed about the climate debate as well as the greater urgency, it's that the economics has shifted so decisively in the direction of making this transition speedily and with the urgency it needs rather than delay. And I think, you know, we kind of knew that a decade ago, that it was the right thing to do, that the costs of not acting were greater than the costs of acting. But I think it has become now, certainly for us, the cheaper, more economically efficient option.
Before I turn to Emma, let me ask you one other question, Ed, which is, in terms of painting a picture of the future, for workers who have felt unmoored from the economy, who felt left out and left behind, what's the narrative? What's the story? Biden has really tried to lean in the U.S. to this idea that this can not only be a source of jobs, but really a source of good jobs that pay prevailing wages, that come with labor standards. What's the picture like in the UK, well, in terms of the work that needs to get done to accomplish this, the goals of the climate goals that you're laying out?
Well, I think you highlight something incredibly important, John, and I think we can learn a lot from the way in which President Biden talked about this during the campaign, and talking about the jobs opportunity there is in rising to this climate crisis. And when I think about the UK, I think about existing industries. Take steel, for example. We know, I think I'm right in saying that if steel was a country, it would be responsible for the third largest amount of emissions in the world in terms of the steel processes and the amount of emissions. Now, we know steel needs to transition. We know that if we are to have a steel industry in the UK, it's going to need to make that transition. It's not going to be able to do it on its own, the private sector, but if the public sector partners with the private sector, it is possible. So it's about existing industries and how they can make the transition. It's also about the new industries, whether it's hydrogen or manufacturing offshore wind turbines or solar or retrofitting and insulating homes or creating the green spaces we need or manufacturing electric cars. There are all of these job opportunities available. And I do think that it's the countries that seize this opportunity, that have an industrial policy that recognizes this opportunity, that will succeed in the future. And those that hang back, that will lose out. And so I think there is a real opportunity and a really important offer to make to people about the jobs. And as you say, it's not just about jobs, it's about guaranteeing the quality of those jobs, good union jobs at decent wages for people. And I think, I think you and I must have discussed this over the years. We know that demand for change, that demand for having those good jobs has been a long-standing and often unmet demand of people. And people are saying, is this economy really working for me? How are you going to make this economy work for me? And I think this is a really crucial part of the answer.
Well, that's a perfect segue to Emma. Emma, Climate Jobs National Resource Center and Climate Jobs, the state-based tables, which I'll ask you to describe a little bit, have really kind of flipped the question from what do we need to get rid of to what do we need to build. So talk a little bit about the structure of climate jobs and how you've approached the organizing, which is a labor-led initiative.
Thanks, John. And it's also an honor to be here with both of you today and at CAP, so thank you. So the the origin of climate jobs is instructive in response to your question. We were formed by a group of unions in New York in the days immediately following Hurricane Sandy. And these were building trades unions, building services unions. We're soon joined by nurses, by public sector workers, by transport workers, utility workers, all of whom realized a few things that were inescapable as we saw what the storm had done to our city. One was that working people, people of color, and union members, neighborhoods with high union density, were hit worst by Sandy. And that climate change was exacerbating and threatened to further exacerbate racial and economic inequities that we see across all of our cities. Another inevitable conclusion was that the climate crisis was here. It was coming for us. It was on our streets. And then that there was a lot of work to be done. There was an enormous amount of work to be done rebuilding New York City, the whole eastern seaboard, but then also what the crisis called out for was the enormous amount of work that we're engaged in now and that we need to continue to engage in resilience, adaptation, and mitigation of the climate crisis. Unions, seeing all of this, leaders who are still leaders of climate jobs today, Gary LaBarbera of the New York Building Trades, Vinny Alvarez of the New York City CLC, Mike Fishman then of New York City's major building services union, came together and said, we need to, as labor, as working people, name this crisis and understand that working people need to be part of the solution. And you mentioned sort of like shifting the narrative on climate action. And I think that's really critical. There's a lot of conversation and worry in both of our countries about like the labor movement, working people are becoming more conservative or looking for different political solutions. And I think it's important to remember that the climate action is not inherently political. It's been politicized in part by fossil fuel companies who make enormous political donations and so wield enormous political power, but it's first a moral issue and then it's also a material one. And so when you take it on that ground and you think about what are the material impacts on people's lives, that's when this notion of transition really starts to resonate. And so in climate jobs, we've always focused on that, on the rebuilding, on all the work that needs to be done. And when working people are at the table having those conversations, that's when they start to trust there will be a place in this new economy for me. This won't be done on my back. So the climate jobs model is essentially that. It's that unions need to be leading, need to be a unified voice, and that we need to have these conversations ourselves. That it's a tricky question and a difficult one, but I think New York offered, to go back to New York for a moment, it offers an important example. Soon after the unions that formed Climate Jobs New York came together, they supported the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York, which set really ambitious renewable targets, got the governor to endorse a 9-gigawatt procurement of offshore wind, which is the Eastern Seaboard's like most abundant natural resource that we can harness, and then 2 years later came back and got labor standards on all the utility scale renewable investments that bill created. So that's the proof of concept that labor's necessary for getting climate goals set. And then the way you have labor at the table is by ensuring that there are labor standards. And when I say labor standards, I mean, you mentioned like prevailing wage. So to ensure that quite literally that renewables are not that employment in renewables is not undermining employment in fossil fuels, in other high emissions industries. It's so critically important. The union-led state-based model in New York has now led to work in 13 states. Unions in 6 states have fully formed coalitions that are staffed and are leading campaigns like the ones pioneered in New York. And we think it's a winning model.
Ed, the one thing that's different in the UK is the Tories aren't positioned as climate deniers, or at least they're not today. We'll see where they end up by the time of the next election. We've just had the results in Australia, which was a kind of climate-led result for Australian Labor with independent support. But the Liberals there, the Conservative Party in Australia, was kind of wrong-footed on climate. Arguably, in the U.S., the Republican Party is kind of denying a reality, at least the national Trump-led party is. But in the U.K., the Tories are, you know, they hosted Glasgow. They've tried to present themselves as a climate leader at the global scale. What's the proposition that you're offering that says that you can do better, that labor will be better for, in both on the climate side, but also on the economic side?
So I think what's interesting is that, as you say, one of the good things about the UK debate is that neither major party is in a denial mindset. When I passed the Climate Change Act in 2008, which put binding emissions targets into law, it was done with cross-party support. So the Tories are definitely not, or not at least the majority, the mainstream position in the Tory party is definitely not climate denial. I think it is climate delay. And so I think part of the difference is we don't feel that they are treating this with the urgency that it deserves. And why is that? And fundamentally, John, it goes to wider ideological questions, which is they think this can be basically done as a market-led, leave it to the individual proposition with a bit of government thrown in. And the problem is that the scale of what needs to happen, the urgency of it, and some of the risks that are involved in terms of the deep pockets you need to fund some of this, means that I think that it won't happen, or it won't happen fairly to people. And in a way, that's the thing I would want to highlight, which is this transition going to be fair? So I talked about the steel industry. How is it going to transition? Well, if you just say that the companies themselves have got to fund this, it's just not gonna happen. It's got to be a partnership model. If you think about a householder who eventually is going to make a transition, say, to a heat pump, you know, how are they going to have a sufficiently insulated home for that heat pump to be effective? How are they going to afford the heat pump? If you think the market is going to deliver this on its own, it's just not going to. And so I think the big stumbling block for the Conservative government on this is the sort of Rubicon they won't cross is this question of public investment. And that's why we made the climate investment pledge that we did, was in part because we think there's economic advantage in it, in part because we think it's actually the prudent choice, because if we store up these costs for the future, it'll end up being a lot more costly, but also because I think if we want to guarantee fairness in the way this transition happens, we need that scale of public investment. And in a way, you know, from a sort of the point of view of, you know, my kids who were 11 and just about to turn 13, you know, I want a mainstream debate where both parties say the climate challenge is a really important threat, because I think it's actually better for the outcomes we'll get. So I welcome that, but I think there is a difference, and I think it is a difference that the public kind of get, because I think basically people think the Conservative government makes big promises on climate, but they don't really deliver.
Well, Emma, the climate jobs had some success in places that you think of as, you mentioned New York. It's quite embedded now in the Northeast, big success in Illinois, but also working in more challenging spaces. I would say at the top of that list is Texas. And so when you're operating in a very conservative political environment, where you do have the political leadership at the state level really probably in the camp of near climate denial, what's the strategy? How do you convince workers in those communities and how much moves from the state level to the essentially sub-state level in a place like Texas? Maybe you should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I was just on a call with our with our Texas brothers and sisters. They formed the Texas Climate Jobs Project last year. That effort was led not only by the state AFL-CIO, but by utility unions, electrical workers unions, unions that represent workers in oil and gas. And I give them an enormous credit. I mean, one, for having such a vibrant and active and aggressive labor movement in a state where pretty much all the powers that be are lined up to subvert the interests of working people, but also for realizing that there is, I think the way we talk about climate action there is essentially the same as everywhere. You know, hurricanes batter the Gulf Coast. Also, the work is there. So much of our manufacturing base in the U.S. has moved to the South to escape the power of working people coming together in unions in the North. And so much of the, for example, the offshore oil and gas industry, the workers in that industry understand that what they're building, what they're maintaining, operating is much like what the offshore wind infrastructure will be. Hydrogen, for example, is of a lot of interest to unions in Texas. You know, for the same reason that, so we're expecting an offshore wind lease sale in the Gulf end of this year or early next year. And for the same reason that companies like Shell have expressed interest in leasing that area and in developing renewables there, working people in Texas understand this industry is coming. And so the strategy is different when say your governor is a climate denier, but there are many good, strong members of Congress in Texas who have taken a lead on climate and on issues of importance to working people, workers' rights. And so I think, there's also the city of Austin. It purchases its own energy. And so it has, not to call out Austin as the only blue island, there are local purchasers of energy throughout Texas who understand both that they are going to shift, that they have an opportunity to shift to renewables. The city of Houston is the biggest purchaser of onshore wind in the country. And increasingly, primarily because of the work of the unions in the Texas Climate Jobs Project, they are coupling those renewable targets with labor standards.
At the municipal level?
Yeah, there's a bond in Austin this year.
Ed, is there any kind of similar structure? How do you work with, with your colleagues who are running municipal governments or?
Well, I think what's very striking listening to this is that I think there is a resonance because a lot of the big enthusiasm for action on climate is coming from local grassroots organizations and people, and indeed local leaders. So our Labour mayors from around the country, Sadiq Khan in London, Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, made a big priority of climate and pressing forward on climate. And it's not just true there, it's true around the country. And what's interesting is that the official government position is a net zero by 2050 position. You find local leaders bidding for earlier, more urgent responses. And then the other aspect to this, which I think is really fascinating, is that we have these climate assemblies being formed in different parts of the country, whereby local leaders will get local citizens, sometimes a representative group, like a deliberative democracy setting, to come and deliberate about what they want to happen in their own area. And I think part of this is just making it very practical for people. I can't speak for the United States, but in Britain, outside London, local bus services are just a massive, massive problem and a massive challenge for people who don't have cars. Access to local bus services, actually making this practical for people about how do you improve it, something Andy Burnham, for example, has done in Greater Manchester, how do you have a proper regulated bus service which is actually going to take people from where they want to go? And obviously this speaks to a future agenda around the transition to electric buses, and you know, having a kind of clean option, a clean green option for people. So, and if I think about this whole insulation retrofit agenda, it can't be led by it can't be done by central government. It's going to have to be led locally. So I think local government has a huge role to play in both kind of galvanizing the support for this transition, for this change, and also delivering it, frankly.
Let's shift a little bit to from the national level to the global level. I mean, there's a race on to not only deploy these technologies, but to build them in the first place, whether that's electric vehicles, renewable power, green hydrogen that Emma mentioned. In the context of building out that strategy, that industrial base, in the U.S. there's been a good deal of attention on trying to reshore supply chains. We're now in a contentious spat around solar tariffs with respect to imports from Southeast Asia, which hopefully will be resolved in the next couple of days. The EU is developing a carbon border adjustment mechanism to try to protect its industrial base. What's going on in that score in the UK? And then I'll turn to Emma and ask her how unions are thinking about that.
So I think this is very interesting. You see, take offshore wind. We are the global leader in offshore wind generation in the UK. Just like, you know, we have some drafty homes, we also have a lot of wind. It's a windy country in the UK. But we are not the global leader when it comes to the jobs you get in offshore wind. And too often, the manufacture is done elsewhere. And, you know, I think it's really interesting looking at a country like Denmark, say, because they have a proper industrial policy, industrial strategy to say we're gonna do this in our country. We're gonna manufacture here. And I think what we want to do with this climate investment pledge is make it speak to that industrial policy that we need. Because I think if we are gonna, and I'd be very interested to hear Emma's perspective on this, I think if we're going to show people that this transition can really benefit them, their kids, themselves, in terms of workers, we have to show that we can create the jobs, that the jobs will be there. That it isn't just we're going to, you know, generate the wind, that it's going to be made elsewhere. And so I think there's a real lesson to learn from that. And also, I'm very struck in going around the UK. I was at the largest onshore wind farm in England and Wales a couple of weeks back, which supplies 15% of the power to Welsh homes. So it's kind of a big wind farm. And who is it owned by? It's owned by Vattenfall, a Swedish company that is 100% owned by the Swedish government. So the Swedish government sees it as sensible to invest in UK wind farms, but the British government isn't so interested. So I think
they're probably paying Swedish pensions with the profits that they're earning off of UK wind.
Well, exactly. Well, that's exactly right. And so part of this is, you know, are we going to be serious about our own industrial policy and understanding the opportunity that there is here? And actually, frankly, you know, the government making the investment, you know, some of the upside can come back to people in the UK. So I think there is lots to be done here. I think the whole carbon border adjustment mechanism issue does need to be looked at. It's a complex area, but it's obviously something that needs to be properly examined.
Emma, how are unions seeing that in the United States?
We see the exact same thing, and I think, Ed, you know, I've thought of the UK as both a model for our offshore wind work, but also, no offense, a cautionary tale. You are so far ahead on gigawatts, certainly, and that's something for us to aspire to. but that, as you just described, not a lot of the manufacture, the supply chain is really like the long tail of jobs in renewables. And so we, I think, are at a moment of opportunity in that regard in this country. You know, it's so important when you think about energy prices, which have skyrocketed, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic in recent months, that you think about ratepayers, customers, as not in this like segregated interest group. They are working people. If it matters how much your energy bill is, it matters how much how much you're earning in your paycheck, and people don't want, if there's an alternative, folks don't want to buy cheap solar panels from China, but we need to support, with public investment, we need to support the manufacture of solar panels so that the ratepayers are the ones earning high road wages with high road union jobs, making them. I think you mentioned heat pumps, and I think we actually recently sent a labor delegation to Europe and learned one anecdote that I've been thinking a lot about is that the Danish climate minister told us that they had recently sent a letter to every Danish household saying, we're going to give you a heat pump, or you're going to install a heat pump, here's how we're going to help you. And that's, Denmark is sort of like, it can be that kind of like tiny laboratory in a way, but it also is, it's embracing this model of talking to people with respect, like you're part of the solution here, and then also shows the public investment necessary, like that the idea that we're building new things will help you get there. This matters as a matter of national security, whether we are energy independent, and this is how government is taking a lead and getting us there. So I think, I think it's critically important that we start talking about energy policy as security policy. That's been cast into stark relief in recent months. And I also understand that I think that recent polling has shown that that rising energy prices right now are making Americans, and I assume folks in the UK, think that it's time to get real on climate action.
I think that the question right now is going to be, do people really sense that? I think there's a lot of polling in the U.S. which suggests that they do believe that the movement towards clean energy will actually help on household bills. But it's hard to make that tangible in the next few months. I don't know, Ed,
well, it's interesting this because we have, I mentioned our planning system earlier, we have hundreds of wind and solar projects which are sort of ready to go. They actually have planning permission, but they are being blocked because of the way the gateway into the energy system that the government has. And they made a recent decision to not allow all of these projects in, and that's just going to drive up bills for people. So I think I think you're right. I think that there's definitely a tangibility issue, but I think we can make it tangible because, if you want to move quickly, getting up a wind farm is actually the quickest way to go, or solar panels. So I think there's that, and I think then crucially there's also the energy efficiency piece. That is the thing that can make the biggest sort of medium-term difference, if you like, to people's level of bills. Certainly in the UK, and it's different context from the US, I think, because gas prices are so high. I don't mean petrol prices, but I mean the gas that people pay for in their own homes are so high. It's so clear the advantage you get from going renewable, and that's what all of the polling shows. So I definitely think it is a very much a winnable argument.
I mentioned at the beginning the conversation I had with David and Ed last year on environmental justice. In the United States, that's become a kind of central feature there's been action this week by the president's team demonstrating their commitment to actually implementing Justice 40, which pledges to spend 40% of the investments on communities, disadvantaged communities, particularly communities of color that have borne the brunt of air pollution and other industrial pollution over decades and more, really. How central is that in that idea of helping communities that have really been hit hard by the effects of pollution on those communities in the UK? I notice you chair the IPPR.
Yeah. I did chair it, and look. I think in a way there's a broader point here, isn't there? Which is, I guess there's two broader points. One is that we talk about climate action as being about dealing with this existential threat, but it is also about I know this is a very ugly word, but the co-benefits of acting. And one of the obvious ones, John, and you put it really well, is around air pollution. If we can get petrol and diesel cars off the road, it will make a significant difference to the silent killer of air pollution, which disproportionately affects poorer people in the UK. And so we could, so absolutely to that. And then the second piece of this, which I think is also important, is implicit in your question, is I represent a community in Doncaster, ex-mining community. The mining jobs have gone. They haven't been replaced by jobs that are as well paid, that are unionized in the same way. This is an offer for the future to deal with the deep inequalities that we have in our country. Where are the good jobs at decent wages going to come from? This is in part where they're going to come from. And so, we don't want to overclaim or overstate the case here, but I think, it is absolutely about tackling the inequalities that people feel so strongly, as I said earlier, are part of the economic settlement that we currently have and transitioning to a different economic settlement.
Emma, somewhat the same question. In the past, the environmental justice advocacy community here in the U.S. has been at odds with the labor community. What's labor's strategy for bringing those jobs into communities and particularly disadvantaged communities, and bringing people both into the workforce and into better health outcomes that Ed talked about?
Yeah, it's critical and central to our work in all of the states. So I think the top line question of how do you build a new economy equitably and inclusively is the job question. There has to be an end to the pipeline, and that end has to be in high road jobs, jobs where there is workplace democracy, labor peace, prevailing wage, and then you work backwards. How do you get people into those jobs? Proven high quality union apprenticeship programs. We've been doing this. We've been training people for highly technical, potentially dangerous work for decades in the labor movement. How do you make sure that those traditionally exclusive and small apprenticeship programs are attracting or are entering an inclusive population, one that's more diverse than historically has been the case? You do it with pre-apprenticeship programs, and they're apprenticeship readiness programs, basic math skills, job, showing up on time to the job, and you make sure that those pre-apprenticeship programs have things like not tuition assistance, but like essentially you're earning an hourly wage while you're in the program, so you don't have to choose between working and studying. There's childcare support, there are transportation stipends for materials, all of the things that historically have been a barrier to people who are approaching the apprenticeship system from different places. And then once you have that inclusive workforce, you make sure that the jobs that are created, that when there's a project labor agreement, which is the way we bargain contracts with construction employers, but this could happen in any sort of segment of industry, there are targeted and community hire provisions so that you ensure that folks who are working on a project, maybe 10% of them are coming from the zip code immediately around the project. 30% of them are coming from high poverty zip codes within the city. As I'm mentioning these numbers, they're coming from the project labor agreement that governs work at the Port of Los Angeles, which a group of unions negotiated with that employer. And we have seen these models are, the labor movement, we want to grow and we want to be more inclusive, and we understand that that's the path to growing. It's the right thing to do. It's also the pragmatic thing to do, as is so often the case. So there are models in Maine, in Connecticut, in Illinois, where there has been this support successfully for pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs, and it's got to be coupled with the high road jobs at the end for everyone.
We have time for just a couple more questions I want to ask. One that's kind of technical, and then one that's really broad. The technical one is around green hydrogen. In part, one of the things that we heard when we did the climate jobs trip to Europe is that the need to provide alternative sources of gas in Europe, where, as you noted, Ed, they're much more dependent on Russian gas, trying to get out of it, trying to get the oil embargo in place in the EU. But and they're trying to source more U.S. gas, question about how much fossil fuel infrastructure is being built. One of the answers to that I heard repeatedly was that the infrastructure we're going to build in terms of import terminals, et cetera, is going to be hydrogen ready. The Greek prime minister was just here visiting the president, made that point in his address when he was at the White House. How excited are you about hydrogen? Obviously there's a lot of interest in green hydrogen for industrial use because of the ability to provide a high heat source, but is it an alternative, and what are we going to do to make sure that it's green, actually?
Well, look, it's a really interesting question, and like any technology that is sort of emerging, you can't be absolutely sure about what the picture looks like. I was recently at the largest manufacturer of electrolyzers in the UK for green hydrogen. It was a sort of really exciting place where you really felt this was part of the future. I certainly think that when it comes to the industrial processes that you talked about, there is real and justified interest in what green hydrogen can do. And using renewable sources to produce the hydrogen, which can really make a difference in the future. So I think it does need to be supported. I'm really struck that in Germany, I think they're putting a large bet on hydrogen, on green hydrogen. We're not really doing that at the same scale in the UK. Again, it's a case where public investment can make a real difference. I think the other thing I would say, John, about this, and I think this is sort of based on my experience, is this challenge is so great that we need all of the tools at our disposal. And hydrogen will be part of the answer. And so I think making those investments now in green hydrogen, when you look at the cost, it's not necessarily, it isn't the lowest cost technology obviously at the moment, but I think making those investments now, when you think about the way in which the costs of solar and wind have come down, which we wouldn't have dreamed of even 10 years ago, I think is the right thing to do.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think the same about the both and all of the above solutions. And in a way, it's an old model. I come out of the Steelworkers Union, and where you see a steel plant, you usually see a coal-burning power plant right near it. So co-locating these things has always been the most efficient, and the synergies there cannot be ignored, as I mentioned, especially in the Gulf. I think will be very exciting. Unions in New York and Illinois are also organizing that we have the DOE's Hydrogen Moonshot program. They're hoping to get hydrogen hubs in their states, so labor is very excited and focused on it.
Yeah, to your point, Ed, about cost, I think the administration has the money through the infrastructure bill and a desire to use that money to really, through this hydrogen moonshot, to drive the cost of production down. Okay, last question, big picture. What do you think the potential is for greater global solidarity amongst labor unions and labor-oriented parties to try to think through from both a economic transition perspective as well as the kind of political transition? How important is it for parties, unions, et cetera, to be working at least across the Atlantic, if not across the globe?
I think it's absolutely crucial. And, you know, it's easy to lose sight of this because there's something about the climate challenge which it tends to get eclipsed by other things that seem, for understandable reasons, more urgent and more immediate. But it is the biggest, we know it's the biggest challenge that we face. And we know we face an absolutely colossal challenge of making sure that this is that for workers, this works out in the right way. We have experience in the UK, I have experience, as I said earlier, in my constituency, of a bad transition, which was what happened to the coal mines. And so this is why it's so interesting to hear about the work you're doing around the trade unions. I think this being an alliance of industry, unions, government, green organizations, it's the only way that this works. And the dialogue, the transatlantic dialogue, the dialogue with Europe, with all of the, you know, this challenge is so big that, and so many countries are facing this, that we can absolutely learn from each other. You know, I've only been here 24 hours, but already I'm learning huge amounts about the approach you're taking here, the approach the president has taken. So this dialogue, this cooperation, seems to me to be absolutely an essential part of making the progress and the transition that we need to make.
Emma?
Couldn't agree more. I think it's imperative. And in the labor movement, one of the ways that we think strategically is to think, how are the employers thinking? And you better believe that industry is thinking globally about this shift, about the climate crisis. And we as progressive forces and as forces that care about the future of working people in this transition, along with climate, need to be thinking transatlantically and globally too.
Well, I'll just close by saying that I think the need for coordination, particularly at the transatlantic level, is probably also the one lever we have to try to accelerate change in China, which you don't consider. I mean, we know that's a huge problem. We know that if they don't accelerate the reduction of their reliance on coal, the 1.5 is really going to be beyond the reach of the world. But I think if we're aligned in gearing our economies to making that transition, I think that's the one pressure point that changes the dynamic in China as well. Well, it's been great to be with the two of you, and I look forward to further collaboration, as the last question implied.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.